Inga Fraser, and I'm the assistant curator working with contemporary and 20th century collections here at the gallery. Today's event obviously relates to the display upstairs in 38A, a display of portraits by Susan Aldworth. Produced as part of a commission for Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in Westminster, the works on display upstairs portray 3 individuals with epilepsy. In addition to the collection and display of portraits of the great and the good in British history, part of the gallery's mission is to develop and explore issues relating to contemporary portraiture within contemporary art. And the artist behind these works is Susan Aldworth. So Susan studied philosophy at Nottingham University and printmaking at Sir John Cass in London. Susan is a senior research associate at Swansea Metropolitan University and a part-time lecturer at Norwich University of the Arts. Currently artist in residence at the Institute of Neuroscience at Newcastle University, Susan's work over the past 15 years has explored the relationship between our sense of self and a range of medical and neuroscientific imagery, both contemporary and historic. And she works in a range of media. Her solo show, Transients, opened at GV Art today in Marylebone and runs until the 20th of July. Today she'll be discussing identity, consciousness and representation with 2 people who've been an inspiration for her as an artist. Paul Brox is a freelance writer with a background in clinical neuropsychology and neuroscience. His first book, Into the Silent Land, was published in 2003 and mixes neurological case stories, fiction and memoir with an extended mediation on selfhood and the brain. Paul has also written for the theatre, including collaborations with the director Mick Gordon on 2 plays, On Ego in 2005 and On Emotion in 2008, both of which premiered at the Soho Theatre and subsequently toured internationally. He co-wrote and narrated Martino Unstrung in Knox's 2008 feature documentary about the recovered amnesiac jazz guitar virtuoso Pat Martino, and recently collaborated with Hugh Hudson and Mariam Dabo on a film about stroke survivors titled Rupture, Living with a Broken Brain. Paul is also a regular contributor to WNYC's Radiolab show, and his next book will be published by Penguin and includes excursions into Greek mythology, madness and magic, as well as brain science. Max Eilenberg is a writer and has published several books for children, in addition to a recent volume on the Magna Carta. He's also a sitter in one of Susan's portraits included in the display upstairs, so provides us with a unique viewpoint in relation to today's topic. And on my left, Nick Jones will be our chair for today. Nick is an independent producer and director for TV, radio and online with a long career in arts and factual programming. He's previously worked for the BBC, where he first met Susan, and also at Channel 4 and Film 4. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nick for this evening. And I hope you're all wired up.
Yeah.
Yes?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks very much, Inga. Welcome to you all for what I think will be a fascinating discussion. I'm just going to outline simply how the next hour will go, really. We're going to start with a presentation from Sue, which will explain something about her work. From there, we will hand over to Max, who will talk and read to some of the points that are raised. And then Paul will give us some readings, and then we'll have a more general discussion. And at the very end, there'll be an opportunity for people to ask questions of the panel. But I would ask that we wait until the end. And there will be microphones available, so when we get to that point in the evening, somebody will be at either side or one side to hand you a mic should you wish to ask a question. So, to start us off.
Well, thank you for coming. It's great to have an audience of this size to talk to. I'm going to give you a very, very brief look at my work, but mainly it's not about everything I do as an artist. I want to look at the relationship to the self and the physical brain, and I want to argue that it's much easier for writers to deal with the self than it is for artists, visual artists at any rate. So I've known Paula and Max and admired them both enormously. I'm on the stage, I think, with some of the cleverest men I've ever met, so I'm going to really enjoy talking to them and hearing what they've got to say. My interest, as I say, is in what it is to be me and what it is to be you. Being yourself is inextricably subjective. Only you can be you and only me can be me. And I've come in the last few years to think a lot about portraiture as well, because portraiture has been visual artists' way of showing a person. And in the 21st century, we now have imagery that can show inside a living person. And for me, this imagery has started me to question how I might, as a visual artist, start to show not just the external, the public person, but also give some sense of the internal person as well. Being yourself is easy. You just seem to wake up yourself most mornings. Being yourself is also something, it seems to me, has a very sort of temporal nature. The self I was as a baby is not the same self as I am now, though sometimes I feel like it is. So you've got yourself, you've got this thing called a brain, which is hugely plastic, that changes with you all the time. And one of the things I think about when I'm making my work is if it ever possible to catch hold of the sense of self of anyone. Because as soon as you think you've got it, it's gone. So what I try and do in my work is deal with some of the narratives of self. Now the narratives as an artist are to do with looking at someone on the external surface, as it was with Max. When I was working on the portrait of Max, we spent a lot of time talking together. And the portrait is also an emotional response to Max. Whether it gets near to the self that is Max, I don't know, but we'll get there in a bit. I've worked a lot with brain scans in the past because it seems to me they're a sort of signpost to interiority, a signpost to the self. They're not... they're quite interesting to me as that, and also I'm a great mark maker. I love the lines of a brain. I think they're actually very beautiful, and I think they're truthful. They are what they are, and if the self does come from the processes of the brain, or it's caught up in that whole anatomy of the brain, then in a way they're about as truthful as a visual artist as I can get. I also use film. This is a short clip to explore the self. So, how else do I visualize the self? Sometimes I look at brain scans and make work that's very, very abstract. I use just the white of the paper there to visualize the self. It's as simple as that. These are two ghosts that I made called There Is No Ghost in the Machine. René Descartes made a distinction between the stuff of the mind and the stuff of the body. He believed that the soul or the self was, something that is given to us as a separate entity and maybe, goes off to heaven at the end. So for me, these are very materialistic, philosophically materialistic pieces, exploring the relationship between the body and the self. Does a newborn baby have a sense of self? This is my first daughter, Aggie, at 3 days old. I felt she had a very strong sense of self, an undeveloped sense of self, but I thought I was getting a baby and I was very surprised to get a person. This is a sort of self-portrait where I'm working with brain scans. I've put my own imagination at work. A brain scan is an anatomical information. It seems to offer interiority, but actually it just offers anatomy. So in this piece of work and in this piece of work, I put in my imagination at work. I made some portraits of some people with Alzheimer's. And again, what I did with that was try and show that the sense of self that Mary had, I think she began to feel that she was lost. But maybe she didn't feel that. I felt she was lost. And that's one of the things as an artist, when you're doing a portrait of someone, it's your opinion of someone trying to develop a sense of what they feel about themselves. So it's yourself trying to get a sort of hook into their selves. So I suppose I use neuroscience and neuroscientific imagery as a sort of intellectual way of trying to get inside what another person is. I'm getting less and less convinced by it as an artist, but hey, one always changes. There's 3 people there with portraits of 3 people who I felt had lost their selves a bit to Alzheimer's. And then I did a series of works about schizophrenia, and instead of making a portrait of someone with schizophrenia, I made a portrait of schizophrenia itself. For me, schizophrenia is being out of kilter with yourself, where your body sort of attacks the sense of self. So I reassembled an anatomy, and the only portraits I made of the 3 people I was working with schizophrenia were word portraits, because I felt, again, that they were authentic descriptions of them, rather than trying to do any visualization. This piece of work, very kindly referred to in the studio as ear bottom, which I thought was rather unkind. It's another visual exploration of the relationship between the body and the self. And also tries to reference the extraordinary plasticity of a sense of self that changes as we go through our lives. The portraits at the National Portrait Gallery, for me, are very figurative. This is a portrait of Elizabeth, and I've used very ancient anatomical descriptions alongside cutting-edge brain scans, alongside a photograph of herself, placed in her womb because she was someone who was worried about having children because of the medication she was taking for her epilepsy. And then I get onto the portrait of Max. It struck me today, and things always change when I look at them. Why has Max got his eyes closed in this portrait? I think it's because I wasn't allowed to get to know who he really was inside. I think he was just shutting me out. He'd sat there, we'd talk for ages, but in the end, it's a portrait of someone's privacy. It's not, maybe as an artist one has no right to get too near someone. It's quite a religious portrait, I think. It's a spiritual aspect of epilepsy. And that carries on in the nails that I knocked into his feet. Which is actually just a blob of ink. So, and I also in this portrait put in my own brain scans because I'm trying to suggest that it's a portrait of Max made by me. It's not the true self of Max. And actually looking at it now, it feels like last year's Max. It's not the portrait I would make of him now. And so I think that's a thing that as an artist, and dealing with a subject like the self, where the self is an unstable, fragile thing that keeps changing, it's very hard to visualize it. Recently, I've gone back to, it's a wonderful self-portrait by Helen Chadwick on that side, and that's me pretending that I'm Helen Chadwick. Recently, I've thought that actually the brain is just all that there is. I've gone off brain scans, and I've gone off all sorts of other portraiture. I actually wanted to make a print of a human brain, so it's not intellectual, it's just simple. It's a simple portrait, pressed down, of being human. I worked with the Parkinson's Society. It's ethically approved, and it seems, to me, it's a very sort of profound thing to do. The marks of the brain, it seemed to me, is all I can do as an artist, as a representation of the self. It's pared down, it's honest, and I think the work speaks for itself. And I'd like to finish there.
Okay, thanks very much, Sue. Max, I wanted to ask you what it was like to sit for a portrait, a rather unorthodox portrait like this. What was the experience of sitting, and what was the experience of seeing the finished work?
I'm not sure that the experience of sitting was orthodox or unorthodox, because it was the only time I've ever sat for a portrait. But it's certainly an unorthodox portrait. But it was a wonderful experience in its way. Firstly, because Sue, who's been an old friend for a long time, asked me questions about my condition, the condition of epilepsy, which, as we discussed it, I realized I'd never spoken about, ever, to anybody else. It's a given in my life that I'm epileptic. Actually, I'm a bit of a fraud as an epileptic, because I've been dosed up on drugs for so long, but really I'm a drug addict. I'm a drug-alectic. Most of my symptoms are to do with my medication. But it was fascinating to me that something that had determined the course of my life was, as I say, taken as a given. And it was really very moving to be the object of an intelligent and kind attention over a prolonged amount of time. So that was a marvelous experience, and actually, in a way, a life-changing experience, I'd say. It was extraordinary to see the portrait. The portrait, when I first saw it, was at Sue's house, and we were in the middle of recording a program for radio about the making of the portraits. And I was ambushed by it in her sitting room, where it hung in the 9 pieces that are its constituent parts, taking up half the room. It was very difficult to get a perspective on it. And I was greeted, really, by my face. Massive, eyes closed. An image of myself that I'd never seen, of course. I wasn't sure that I wanted to see it. Who does like looking at their own ugly mug? Then I turned away. I tried to say nice things, but I couldn't sort of encompass the whole. Seeing it then in the portrait gallery and familiarising myself with it, seeing it in relation to the other pictures and seeing that it shares some kind of component parts with them, there are motifs, I felt I'd been, so to speak, reconstellated in a certain way. And although it was last year's image, it's given me an image of myself, mediated by you and by your artistry, that I didn't previously have. And so now when I want to think of myself as an epileptic or whatever, there's always Sue's image in my mind, which is probably a bonus anybody who has their portrait done benefits from. So that was really good. So thank you, Sue. I'm very, very pleased. But insofar as the questions of does it represent me goes, and that Heggs running earlier about is it easier for a writer than an artist to get at the self, I do have doubts. I have things to say on that. I want to just briefly read something that I drafted for an essay in the catalogue on the subject, because as an epileptic I have some doubts about words like identity and representation and consciousness and probably even self. So briefly to introduce this piece, when I was about 16 or 17 and first diagnosed with my form of epilepsy, it was put to my parents that I would probably benefit from trepanning, let's say having a hole drilled in the head. And I'm really glad they declined the offer. But I've often dwelt on what would have happened if they hadn't, if it had been another time, for instance. I also dwelt on why trepanning. And trepanning speaks to a very complex medical and cultural history around the treatment of epilepsy, which veers between the sacred and the scientific. And on the sacred side, ancient stuff, it was when you were held to be possessed by a god or a demon. So drilling a hole in the head was a way of releasing the evil spirit, and that was marginally preferable to drinking fresh blood from the throat of a gladiator who you've just slain. In the scientific era, it was, when epilepsy was a disorder of the humours, it was a hole in the skull that would release excess of phlegm, which was possibly preferable to being castrated, which was which was said in 1880 to have very good results. So I wasn't trepanned, but still that history of epilepsy, which is, as I say, medical and social and cultural, continues to fascinate me, like the trepanning I never had. Or perhaps I should say, like the memory I do not have, the memory of epilepsy. How could I have a memory? I'd have to make it up, because there's no point asking an epileptic to describe what it's like to have a fit. We're the last people to ask. All we know is the before and after, how it felt in those anxious moments before your body started acting without you, and those pale, dislocated periods when you try to piece yourself back together afterwards. But the experience of the fit itself is concealed from those who have it, because epilepsy is characterized by absence, by the extinction of consciousness, memory, interiority, identity, selfhood, call it what you will. Your body does perfectly well without you. It's like a headless chicken. You get parked until it's ready for you to come back, a little bruised, and perhaps then it might admit you, but a little grudgingly. So others can see us when we come round, and they know more than we do about how we looked and about what happened. But the question of the actual experience while we were away, there's only one answer, and the answer is you had a fit. Well, that leaves an awful lot missing. We've got no report, so to speak, from the interior, or maybe there is no interior. Perhaps it was just a short death. So we can look at epilepsy, but we can't really tell. Or rather, we can tell whatever we want. And here are two stories worth trying on for size, personal and cultural. And I think they're related. For the epileptic, individual memory is fractured. Memory is the first condition of identity. But even to ourselves, we're unreliable actors. We're intimate with gaps, with the not being as much as the being, like the strobe lights that can set us off. Memory is also the first condition of story. Without it, nothing makes sense. But the epileptic story is redacted. It's full of holes. We start a sentence and we find, what was that? What was that about? There's no use asking us. We weren't there. Continuity, cause, effect, sequence, pattern, resolution, all gone. We can talk about the before and the after, the discovery and the diagnosis, the treatment and the medication. We can talk about the social strategies, but the essence is a void. It's discontinuity, interruption, absence, silence. It's anti-narrative. There's no way to tell it from the inside. Small wonder, to me, then, that society plugged the blanks as best it could. Like nature, it abhors a vacuum. Magic, religion, fear, science, they pour in to fill it by asking, well, what if? Some of the stories are terrific, but they've all got a hole at their heart. Identity, representation, consciousness. Trepanning is just another story about a hole in the head. It wasn't told in my case, but remembering how it might have gone still seems wholly fitting. Thanks.
Well, fantastic. Paul, how do you react to a testimony like that, or a story, a description like that?
Well, I find it far more interesting than any kind of medical account of epilepsy, and I think it brings out this distinction between what interests Sue a lot, and that's this disjunction between the materiality, the physicality, as you put it, of the physical body. We are embodied beings, and the self, which is memory. It's an act of imagination, I think, ultimately, the self. And I think it's a very rich description that you've given there, and I think the historical perspective is fascinating. I mean, it was Hippocrates who dispelled the notion that it was the sacred disease, because until that point it was thought to be, possession by demons. There's a divine intervention that produced epilepsy. And that's never really been shaken off. I mean, I remember when I was at school, there was one particular boy who had quite severe epilepsy, and we were terrified of him because we didn't believe any of that stuff, but there was still that sense that kind of, you kind of believed it and you didn't believe it. There was something very kind of demonic about the whole thing. And when you see someone in a major fit, it's not just unconsciousness, it's a complete loss of self, complete chaos, and which, of course, as the sufferer, you don't experience. But yeah.
I think you've got some readings that you'd like to give us in leading on from that.
Yeah, I just want to read a couple of short. My voice is about to go up. 2 or 3 short pieces, and I've chosen them because they chime with this notion of this disjunction between our physicality and our mentality, our consciousness. And the first one is just the first couple of brief paragraphs from a piece in the first book I did, which was Into the Silent Land. And the chapter is called The Space Behind the Face. The illusion is irresistible. Behind every face there is a self. We see the signal of consciousness in a gleaming eye and imagine some ethereal space beneath the vault of the skull, lit by shifting patterns of feeling and thought, charged with intention and essence. But what do we find in that space behind the face when we look? The brute fact is there's nothing but material substance, flesh and blood and bone and brain. I know, I've seen. You look down into an open head, watching the brain pulsate, watching the surgeon tug and probe, and you understand with absolute conviction that there's nothing more to it. There's no one there. It's a kind of liberation. In the next book, which is partly somewhat similar to the first in the sense that there are a few neurological case stories. I don't think there's case studies, they're more stories, I think. But it's much more kind of autobiographical. Around the time I started to think about this book, my wife was very ill with cancer, and she died 2.5 years ago when, I just kind of disrupted the whole thing, really. And she lived to see, she died 2 days after our first granddaughter's second birthday. So this is about our granddaughter, Millie, when she just turned 3, about 3 and a bit, I think. And it sort of picks up on that theme I've just referred to. Millie, the other day I played a game with our 3-year-old granddaughter. I got her to cover her eyes with her hands, and I asked some questions. Now, Millie, can I see your feet? Yes. Can I see your tummy? Yes. Can I see your hands? Yes. Can I see you? No. Ha ha. And of course, I never will. There's nothing to see. Behind the laughing eyes, beneath the silky hair, the bony box of her cranium contains nothing but a few 100 grams of jellified fats, proteins, sugars, salts, a brain. She is biological machinery all the way through. There are no spirits coursing through her brain circuits, just neurochemicals. On the scale of human history, she's more transient and fragile than a soap bubble. No part of her ebullient consciousness will survive her death, and no memory of her will survive mine. That's a difficult thought, but it deepens my love for her. Watching Millie skittering back and forth into a gentle sea, naked and unabashed, a barrage of bright smiles, the words come back to me again. You don't know how precious life is. You think you do, but you don't. Those words were, when my wife Sonia was dying, it was kind of a constant refrain. She said, you really don't understand how precious life is. Make sure you do. Make sure you try to understand how precious it was. So that's just a glimpse of that one. The next brief one is a piece of Mischief, really. I take a fairly conventional, sort of materialist, functionalist view of the mind as the workings of the brain. I think consciousness is a mystery, and it may be an insoluble mystery, but it doesn't worry me too much. But I do like to put mischief to philosophers sometimes. I had this idea, and it was part of a play that I was working on, where a character who's a priest has having a conversation with a neuroscientist. I'll read the piece, and I'll explain what it means if you need any explanation. Picture a great forest. Let's say it's the dead of night. A storm is raging. At the heart of the forest, a brawny oak sways and shakes in the howling wind, resplendent with 1,000,000 leaves, invisible in the dark. Its branches whip this way and that, clashing with the boughs of neighbouring trees. Oak, sycamore, beech and alder bustle shoulder to shoulder. Billions of raindrops are bombarding millions of shuddering leaves. Rainwater drips and trickles through the canopy, cascading down to the protected understory of saplings and shrubs, dogwood and holly, into the undergrowth where ants and beetles scurry, down into the earth. All is action and connection. Countless drops of water, countless twigs and leaves in constant, fleeting interaction, gusts and zephyrs of wind, shaping large and small-scale patterns of association and energy flow. Picture yourself sheltering under the oak tree in the dark. And then, from nowhere, flashes the image of a tiger. It's visible for 2 or 3 seconds, but not to you. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. All you see are black shadows and glimpses of gloomy cloud over the crown of the tree from time to time. The rain stops, the wind subsides, the forest is still. Have moonlight if you want, but there's no sign of a tiger. Why would there be in an English forest? Okay, so the idea is that the mischief behind this is that if what consciousness is just complex patterns of interaction between neurons in the brain, then isn't it possible, isn't it just remotely possible that there might be certain patterns of action in a forest or in ripples across a cornfield or waves breaking on a beach or a sandstorm where there's a replication of a flash of consciousness? It's just, I don't believe there is, but I haven't had a really good counter-argument yet. So, and I just wanted to do another one very briefly, which brings out the idea of this idea that we often, and I think this is true of ourselves and self-consciousness, we often believe things to be true, but know them to be false. So in other words, we can hold completely contradictory ideas in mind, and it's kind of almost essentially human to be able to do that. This is from a story called The Messenger, and it's about a friend of mine who was an undergraduate with me many years ago. An old friend of mine also lost his wife to cancer. The morning after the funeral, as he and his children were eating breakfast, a bird flew in through the open window as if to present itself. It sang sweetly for a minute and flew off, leaving a deep tranquility. Tony is a scientist with no belief in the supernatural, but he was convinced the bird was a messenger. Liz, his dead wife, was reassuring him. Don't worry, everything will be fine. And that's how it made them all feel. Everything will be fine. I know it wasn't her, he said, but I also knew that it was. I hadn't seen Tony since he and Liz emigrated to New Zealand. That was 20 years ago. We'd lost touch and I got to hear of Liz's death only through a colleague. Now here we were, Tony and me, sipping beer by the harbour in Auckland, at the intersection of his past and my future. I felt Tony's grief the more because I could glimpse my own just up the road. There's a crack in his voice. I constrained a tear, and then we talked about sailing. I know it wasn't her, but I also knew that it was.
Thank you very much. So, Paul, how would you describe the contrast between you and Sue in terms of your approach?
I love Sue's work, but we're going in completely opposite directions, okay? So I'm trying to unlearn the academic stuff. I've been a clinician and an academic, and I've studied neuroscience and anatomy. I'm trying to get away from that in a way to find out what it really means to be a self and what the connections between the self and the meaty stuff might be. Sue, I think, is going in the diametrically opposite direction. You're looking for signposts of the self. And I would prefer to look from the brain outwards in a way, and you're looking kind of outwards into the brain. But I think the fascination is, we share the same fascination, and that is that that there is this, we are embodied, we are conscious, we are unified, we're continuous. We can't take any of those things for granted, and it's that sort of fundamental mystery. And I think we should also distinguish between problems of the self and problems of consciousness. I think they're quite separate, and I think we may well have good scientific solutions to the problem of how the brain supports a sense of self. But I'm yet to be persuaded that we'll ever have a theory of consciousness we may have a theory of consciousness, but none that will ever satisfy us because we want it from this first-person perspective. And science just doesn't go there. We can have wonderful third-person scientific descriptions of the neural correlates of consciousness, and I'm sure we go a long way to discovering what adds up to consciousness. But there'll always be that kind of that tantalising. We're not quite there yet, and I think we never will be because we want our cake and we want to eat it. We want an explanation from the first person. We want an explanation of the quality of consciousness, and I don't think science gets there.
How do you respond to that?
No, I mean, I think we meld in what you're saying at the end very much. I mean, I play with trying to find ways of exploring the ideas visually because I need some building blocks. And I've got some building blocks. It's good. And I think that for me, sort of the imagery of the inside anatomy is hugely thrilling because I'm a mark maker, because of the fact that it seems to me to give me a very strong language to work with. But it's not enough. I was saying before, I'm now trying to just print the brain as I'm sort of always looking for ways to explore it. And my big obsession at the moment is to try and find a way of finding a way to explore someone else's experience of my work. Because, you know, someone else, the self that is another person, seems to me endlessly more fascinating than any form of self-portraiture. And portraiture is what I fixed on as my way of exploring around the outside of, well, the inside and the outside of what it means to be a self. So I'm taking all this imagery, but as you could see from the film that I made at the beginning, actually my natural inclination is much more lyrical than scientific. So I'm borrowing science, but I'm not illustrating it all, and I don't feel it's to be, you know, it has to be literal.
Max, you at the beginning alluded to you had some strong opinions on the ideas, on the idea of self and consciousness, and how would you?
Yes, I'm. Well, I think I might have said to you at some stage, because I am not a scientist, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm certainly not an artist. These are just, to me, big words, and they make me unhappy as I try to grapple with them. I'm not certain in myself. I think there's a biological continuity in my brain, in my body, in my cells, and they regenerate and so forth. My experience and my imagination somehow tell me that self is a discontinuous, a discrete set of moments. Identity provisional, contingent, representation also provisional, and because of that, I think that I feel in myself that the attempt to get to an adequate representation is bound always to fall on a fallacy, and the fallacy is that there is something to represent, and that representation in any way could identify with this thing that doesn't really exist. So that's my feeling. I'm sort of profoundly sceptical.
But you recognise yourself, your face. You know, that's a continuous aspect of you.
Yes, I must confess it. I do recognise my face there. I cannot deny it.
You don't wake up and see Nelson Mandela in the mirror, you know. No.
No, but I don't. But I could wake up from an epileptic fit and not recognise anything at all. And I've had that experience often enough to feel that my ability to recognise myself is in permanent jeopardy.
And do you lose the sense of who you are?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Yes, you have. In order, I mean, it's a profoundly odd experience. Coming to my experience, as I recall it, is that it's profoundly odd, or perhaps as I've imagined, or perhaps as I've invented. I might have invented that whole story about trepanning, actually. But my memory is that there's no such thing as self at the moment that you come to. You have no idea who you are, what you are, who those, you could be your mother looking down, you just don't recognize them. It takes a long, long time to reconstitute yourself. And when you do reconstitute yourself, you're both a little less than the thing you were before, and a little bit more in that you are the thing you were before, plus an epileptic fit, as it were. But I've never had enough epileptic fits. Maybe this doesn't happen to. Maybe it does happen to people who have a lot of epileptic fits, to come out and immediately sort of recognise, oh well, this is the syndrome of a recovery from epilepsy. Everything is nameless. There are no words. There's no shape. There's no form. There's no sense of self-recognition. Yeah.
I think that's not an unusual description of that sort of post-fit experience. But there is a condition which is the opposite of that, quite the opposite, where people have a real sense of stuff around them, where they have a real sense of who they are, but no sense of the stuff around them. So they give you quite a reliable account of their life, but they don't think they exist. But when you came out of fits, you had a sense that you existed, but there was no kind of narrative that linked with it.
Words like existence would have no meaning.
Okay.
Bits would gradually coalesce into a pattern. And you're right, I do recognise myself. I do end up recognising myself as those bits coalesce. But I've always thought that for somebody who wasn't adequately medicated, who had continuous epileptic fits or a lot of epileptic fits in a day, it would be simply impossible to form a sense of self. And I don't know if that's the case. I imagine people who are just constantly fitting would be absent the whole time.
So I want to ask you about, you talked about the difference between representation, visual representation and written representation. How, explain a little more about that.
Well, I just think that if you, that words, written words and spoken words give us we have a vocabulary of describing the self. I mean, that's what novelists, in a way, have always done. They take you inside someone else's life. And they don't just describe the life, they show you the self working through their lives. So you get a sort of, you can become someone else, imaginatively for a bit. And I think for artists, it's so much, visual artists, I mean, it's why I like working in moving image, because you can bring huge amounts, many different narratives together to try and explore it. But in the end, portraiture is complex because it is the external. Even when you start representing the internal as well, there's a staticity to it. And maybe it's just the medium. Maybe I've got to start just working in time-based medium, that nothing ever stays still. So I think I'm slightly frustrated with, I like the work, but I just feel it's time to sort of find another way of, in fact, I quite like it, things that just move off the page. It doesn't have to be there forever.
So,
end of my selling
temporary.
career.
Yes, exactly. And I wanted to ask you about the thing that sent you on this, in this direction, really, the original. What was it about that experience that you had? Perhaps you can tell us about that, because it's fascinating. It's fascinating how your work changed overnight, really.
Well, it nearly feels like someone else's story, and I get a bit embarrassed of talking about it. I collapsed in my studio with a suspected brain hemorrhage and ended up on an operating table in a hospital having a brain scan while I was conscious, so looking inside my brain through a scan real time. And it was just, it's a moment of suddenly questioning who I was, being very frightened about whether I was going to survive it, but also thinking I was watching myself think. And for someone who studied philosophy, it was a sort of marvellous moment of taking hold of a subject matter and running with it. Plus, I found it beautiful as well. So that was the moment that has sort of informed the work ever since. But I think the work now is beginning to change. And this latest work, as I say, of taking the brain as object rather than as a series of digital scans, I feel like another journey. Don't know where it will take me yet.
We're almost getting to the end of our time, but we do have some time for questions from the audience. If we can, do we have any mics handy? Great. Lady in the front row here.
If she has precedence, I'm happy to.
Oh, no, sorry, okay. Oh, sorry, it was the first one I saw.
Hello. Oh yes. I just wanted to pick up a little on the language and image distinction, and it was just that you have such a particular use of language, and I just wondered whether you felt yourself more to be in your use of language, and whether at what point language returns to you.
I have such a particular use.
Well, yes, you use language very beautifully, and I just wondered whether that was where you felt there was a continuous, and whether you...
Well, thank you for saying that, but no, my memory, such as it is, of recovering from a fit is of not knowing any words, of knowing nothing. So, and I don't feel that my identity is if I'm understanding the question correctly, I feel that I do constitute my identity to an extent through language. That's what I have to do as a writer, and I suppose that's what we all do all the time anyway when we present to one another. But I think that the language I use is artificial. It's been much more primitive at times. It's certainly more primitive when I come out of it. And so one of the great pleasures in life of not being out of it is to be able to construct a more elaborate sentence, and with it a more elaborate persona to present through language. But I don't think that there's a relation, for me, I don't think that there's a relationship between a sort of elaborate sentence and myself any more than I would think there would be if I were writing in the style of Mickey Spillane. I wouldn't think that was me anymore. It would just be a style, I think.
Is this working? Can you hear this? Okay.
Perfect.
Well, thank you, all of you, for very interesting presentations and discussion. There were two points that came up that rather surprised me. One was that, Sue, you didn't say anything about, if you like, a comparison between the work that you have done and have presented here, and indeed upstairs, and all the other things that are in this gallery, where artists over the centuries have striven to, capture the identity or the self of their subjects. Are they wasting their time?
No. What I'm talking about is just what I do. No, there's some extraordinary, wonderful portraits here, and I have what I'm saying is not to criticize other artists. It's purely in the context of this discussion, trying to explain what I do and why I do it. No, I'm hugely, gracious and in admiration of other people's work.
Okay, well, then a follow-up question is, are they, but by that token, successful do you think, in capturing selves? Or is it something else, because we've been questioning whether in fact the self exists? Is it something else that those artists that seem to us somehow to have done wonderful things, is it something else that they've captured, or are we involved in a very, very complex and elaborate sort of self-deception?
Does anyone
Paul.
It's a very good question.
Well, I think when you look at a conventional portrait, it triggers a whole lot of responses, many of which are very automatic, and a lot of which we know quite a bit about the substructures in the brain that mediate them. So, when you look at just any face, you react to you immediately can identify the gender, the age, the emotion. That sort of triggers reactions in the viewer. In that sense, Sue's work it challenges all of that, because it tears things apart and it reorganizes stuff. But that's one of the things I think, it's a very exquisite challenge, because if you want to kind of set that alongside scientific studies of selfhood, the same things are happening. And even in sort of everyday clinical neurological work, you see people who have fragmented selves. A stroke will make someone lose one aspect of their memory or of their perceptual function or whatever. So we are fractionable. We do break down into, and we do have. It's not people who have epilepsy every day. As Sue said, we have to kind of rediscover ourselves. When you go through a period of dreamless sleep, it is a little snippet of death, I think. But we pick ourselves up from where we were the day before, and we have this sense of continuity. So I think in conventional portraiture, all those things come through in a very kind of automatic level, and the great artist, of course, will layer much more onto that. So, you will read all kinds of things into a portrait that don't depend on those automatic brain triggers. But I think that's the difference between what you do and sort of more conventional work. It's a shock, but it's a shock that has that chimes with the way people think about the self philosophically and also scientifically these days.
Anyone else? Lady here.
Thank you very much. I was really, really interested to hear all three of your perspectives, and I think one of the common threads is that you all talk about a sense of self as a sense of self-knowledge, and one of you said that identity is an act of imagination, which I thought was really beautiful. But it put me in mind of something. I'm coming from a psychoanalytic perspective, and I was very moved to hear you talk about that loss of your knowledge of yourself when you're fitting. But I was thinking that isn't it the case that a very essential part of who we are is our unconscious, which is an unknowable? And I wondered if you had some thoughts on representations of the unconscious aspects of identity.
Stunned silence.
Well, I mean, Surrealism went there a lot in the early 20th century, and I think that one of the things that Paul and I have talked about before is I think that neuroscience. I don't work with the unconscious because I'm trying to fathom out the conscious at the moment. But I think, if Freud and Jung were, the central thinkers culturally around me now, I probably would deal with the self-conscious, unconscious a lot, and be very self-conscious about it.
One of the things that I really liked about how you talk about this portrait is that you were trying to entwine your thoughts about your sitter with their sense of their selves, and so what you've made is a dialogue, and when we look at that portrait, then ourselves are entwined with it. There are three identities together, which is wonderful. Thank you.
Any other questions? Gentleman at the middle there.
I was struck when Max turns to the portrait and says, yes, I can recognize myself. And I think that's exactly what you don't do. Yourself doesn't have a look. Yourself is not represented by that photograph as it was included in the middle of the portrait there. And it's one of the great, almost tragic things about our own sense of self is that we know that other people see our faces, and that's what they think of us as being. But we don't think of ourselves as having that face or having that particular, all the detailed physiology of whichever other people recognize us by. And I think what would have been really brave of Sue to do would have been to make a portrait of you which didn't look in any way like you. I mean, I don't know why she's cheated in a way and put that in the middle of it. It seems to be a kind of gesture to another form of portraiture, which is actually a shame, because it would have been much more dramatic, though much more dangerous, to have tried to represent yourself in Max as a visual representation, which doesn't have anything recognizable to you or to anyone else, at least in terms of straight portraiture.
Well, I'm going to leave Sue to talk about her, far be it from me. But I think you're absolutely right to pick me up on the looseness of language. I didn't recognize myself. I recognized my face, although it's a face I've never seen before. And I don't really want to see again.
No, I think you're right, Nick. It would be much more exciting to try and make portraits, or to try and, if it was trying to represent the self that had no tap to the conventional representation of a face. I agree. It just wasn't brave enough, but maybe I will be next time. My brains are actually that. The new portraits actually have, they are just, but they're not about the self so much as, well, they are. God knows what they're about, but they don't have anything that you probably, would take as representational in that sense, though I do think they are real portraits.
I think we've time for one more question. The lady, yeah.
Thank you. Like everybody else, I've really enjoyed your three talks. And I think I don't know whether mine is a question or a comment, but picking up on the previous comment where you pointed out that Max didn't recognise himself, he looked at his face, although it was a version that he'd never seen before. But as I understand it, if somebody does a portrait of you, you actually, that's not the you see in the mirror, because it's the other way around. So that's one way in which you don't recognise your face. It's a very weird experience. But I was also conscious of the way Sue, and I've had the privilege of listening to you talk about your work before and know your work and love your work. And I'm really intrigued because I'm not sure whether without your commentary I would know it was about the self or searching for the self at all. And indeed, that brings me to the comment that has rolled around my head listening to the three of you, really talk beautifully and very eloquently, that there's a wonderful solipsism going on. Solipsism, not solecism. And it's this paradox, because the harder you search for the self, the more elusive it is shown to be. And each one of you have done that. So Max, you talked so eloquently about the absence of an epileptic fit. And Sue, you were talking about looking for it and not finding it. And then, of course, you, Paul, were talking about the way the science, you doubted if it will ever reveal it. And there's this, yet every one of us believes we can recognise that we have a self and we have some sense of it. But we have enormous difficulty being confident that in whatever way we apprehend it, that we've done it adequately. And so we're perpetually and perennially fumbling towards it, suspecting that we'll never get there until the whole lot's extinguished anyway.
Bravo.
Can I just respond to that? And I think it's one of those things that the self is one of those things that we believe to be true, but when we really think about it, we know it to be false. But it's all we have. It's like if the body is the vehicle that we use to negotiate the physical environment, the self is the vehicle we use to negotiate the social environment. And it's all we have, and we will cling to it, and we may have magical beliefs about it. If we think very hard about it, we may realise that it is completely fractionable, and that will disturb some people. it will disturb some people to think they don't have a soul that is immortal. But we kind of get by with the self by and large. I mean, sometimes it does break down totally, but we get by with it.
Well, a good point at which to finish, I think. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to the three members of the panel who've given us a wonderful and stimulating hour, I think. And I would urge you all to, if you haven't already, see Sue's exhibition upstairs, which is a wonderful thing to behold. Thank you very much.